This bench is normally in my entryway, and so while I have this bench up on the bench, I'll tell you a little bit about it. I'm also going to make an addition to it. Hopefully it's an improvement. I'm going to stick that copper pipe in here so that it can house shoes. A little bit about it. I think the wood is mostly tulip poplar. It has sort of an interesting background. This piece was inside of a piano. Actually, so were lots of the pieces there. It's not entirely done yet, even though I've been sitting on it for a year, because polyurethane just takes forever, and I want to get lots and lots of coats of satin so it will last. But procrastination, life, you understand. I have to be honest about its joinery. As I get older, I'm starting to see fancy joinery as more of an affectation than anything. So there isn't joinery. It's angle iron, and that makes it crazy strong. And from this angle, where you normally see it, you can't tell the difference.
My beard is not an affectation.
Oh.
Oh, did I strike a nerve calling it an affectation? Well, it is. Just like having a wall of block planes or chisels that you don't use. It's just not something that's really practical to use fancy joinery. Part of me would like to show my skill by using dowels or something here, but nobody would really care, would they? And so it becomes more about flaunting something that nobody ever sees than it is about utility. There are the chisels of a true craftsman there, and there are the block planes. Okay, honestly, there's more than that. They're laying around everywhere. In fact, a previous version of me wanted to go down that rabbit hole, and boy, I'm glad I didn't. Look, my point is, if you're going to be creative, be genuine. Be honest about what you find beautiful. This thing has a beauty that it's hard for me to explain, but why it's beautiful to me is because I operated within the restrictions of the material that I found. And so it's kind of like finding a block of marble, and based on the flaws and imperfections of that piece of material, what's the best that you can do with it within those constraints. And this was the best that I could do with what I was working with. And the result, to me, ended up being beautiful. You might not be able to share my aesthetic appreciation, but that's why it's my creation and not yours.
Well, then you wouldn't mind shaving it off.
One might argue the same thing about using joinery here, that it's not an affectation, it's a genuine expression of one's skill for the sake of challenging oneself. Okay, I'll buy that. But in this case, my expression was to make it as strong as possible, as utility-based as possible. And joinery wouldn't suit there. And one final note, at the risk of being tedious, joinery isn't necessarily an expression of skill so much as it is an expression of patience. Although, I guess patience is a developed skill, isn't it? So what do I know? Nothing. Okay, about the thing. It's 11 inches there. Something like 12 and a half there. Something like 54 and a half there. And its height is 18 and a half. The material used to make it is as thick as I could come up with. And the feet have nice, soft, thick felt pads so that you can slide it around on a smooth floor. Apologies for the lousy camera quality. You probably won't be able to make out the rich variety of color and apparent texture that this wood has. But one thing I want you to take note of, the seams are sandwiched in between full-length pieces. And so that's how I was able to build up the thickness and gain a lot of strength. I wanted, the vertical to be nice and strong. And so the sandwich that has verticals here, 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 altogether it makes it nice and tough. And then of course it's capped off with a sort of breadboard design. Purists might complain about that because expansion this way and this way, but honestly it's been, I don't know, a year and a half and everything's still smooth and no cracks. Again, crude joinery here. Not my finest trim work, but that's not the point. And the way that it turned out, I love. Also, I celebrated all of the flaws, filled them all in, epoxied them, doweled them, whatever. The more variety, the better. At least that was the picture in my head. And how it turned out, again, I'm really pleased with. Okay, time to add the copper shoe rack. This will double our shoe capacity because the whole thing was designed to, have shoes there. It filled up way faster than we had hoped, so this will double the amount we can have. The spacing is a prototype on these 2x4s, and I used it in order to, paint them and polish them and everything. I used 4/0 steel wool. I'll give you a close-up. Following the steel wool, I used some brass polish and then obsessively cleaned it with a cotton rag. So the finish that you're seeing there is kind of a spray from the lacquer. It's not so much in the metal. Nice thick coat of lacquer over top. And that should keep them from getting dinged up over the years from shoes. We'll see how it goes. Copper pipes are 1/2-inch pipes, 2.5 inch on center. That gives us like about 8 inches out to out. Nice compromise for my shoes and my wife's shoes. They fit nicely. Oh, sorry, I'm out of level. I have to put my shoe back on. There we go. Let's get this into place on that. How bad does it suck to walk into the hardware store with the intention to buy some angle iron with Gen X expectations, only to end up having to pay Zoomer prices for the stuff? Aging is not for the queasy, but you know what? Beats the alternative. Don't worry, I have to recoat this with another coat of paint. And now for today's lesson on prototyping. Repeat after me. Recreate realistic conditions. In other words, putting shoes on this false shelf here, well, that's one sort of simulation when it's up here on the bench, but it's a whole other thing when it's down there on the floor. And it's a whole other thing entirely when it's actually back where this piece of furniture is going to be. Since I'm drilling holes only once, hopefully, I wanted to get it right the first time. Over the years, we develop a sense of judgment, an intuitive sense that lets us more accurately do things on the first try, a priori, without even necessarily having the experience. But whenever you're in doubt and something's valuable, you have a lot of time invested into it, just don't bother. Fall back on your good old experimental judgment. Stick it in place, try it. We're just going to go through the little extra effort it takes to carry this back in the house and put my shoes on the fake shelf and determine the number that way. Now you might say, why not just cut it in half, put the shelf halfway? Okay, that's one way to solve the problem, but that's not a realistic approach, is it? Because you're going to have your clogs up high and your boots down low, and they don't require the same height. The idea when making something for utility is you take in as many variables as you can consider. As much stuff as you can imagine, stick it all in the blender, and pour out this piece of art. Now things are a little different. Context. A few more considerations to consider. That is what you do with considerations, right? You consider them. The higher up we get this little shelf, the easier it will be to see in there. It will let light in, and the easier it will be to clean. Another thing is that when people sit on this, the higher up the copper is, the less likely somebody will be to stick their foot on it. And so from this context, it looks as though 7 inches to the top of the copper will be nice. And that gives me something like, oh, I don't know, like 9.5 inches in here. That's a nice variety. Comfortable room in both spaces, but a little less here. It's a little tighter. No go. Seven inches down from the top. First we find center of the width. This is 10 7/8. That would be 5 plus 7/16. 5 7/16 from each side. And then whatever the error is, it's halfway in between those two little marks. Once again, it was 10 7/8. Do the easy part first. Half of 10 is 5. Okay, 5. 7/8, that's tricky, but not really. You just double the denominator. Half of 7/8 is 7/16. So again, 5 7/16 from each side. Make 2 marks, and your exact center is in between those 2 little marks. Top down, 7 inches, but that top down is 7 inches to the top of the copper. But the copper has a thickness of 5/8 of an inch. Use the same trick. What's half of 5/8? Just double the denominator. Half of 5/8 is 5/16. So 7 5/16 from the top to the exact center. And once again, I can't tell you this too many times, measure from each side. And then whatever error you have, just guess in between the middle of these 2 points. Measuring numerically, you will never get as close as you can get by finding 2 measurements and then eyeballing the center. If you have more than one of these to do, and in this case we do, just extend this type of thinking by using a combination square. This is one of those tools that when you're young, you don't really see the point, and then as you use it more and more and more in your life, it becomes, well, indispensable. I think I already told you that they're 2.5 inches on center. Now, the exact middle of the width isn't where a pipe goes. The pipes are centered around that. 2.5 from center to center means that 1 1/4 will be from the center point to the middle of this. 1 1/4 from here to here, and 1 1/4 from here to here. I'm all over the place, and I'm sorry for that. Back up. 7 5/16. We're doing this again. I'm going to mark it on each side. 7 5/16. Why? Because it's 7 inches from the top down, and then you add the 5/16 because it's half of the width of the copper. That means this 7 5/16 down will be the center of all of my pipes. That's step 1. We should have done that first. Now we'll work on making the centers. 1 1/4 each way from this exact center mark. I pick an integer, and a whole number here. 6 in this case. And then 1 1/4 each way. 1 1/4. Now from there, I'll slide over to an integer again and make another 1 1/4. It's all about reducing the amount of mistakes that I make. Oh, but that was a mistake. From the whole number, we go 2.5. 1, 2.5. This, put it on a whole number. 1, 2.5. And then check everything 3 times. Check everything 5 times from every angle. That's the secret. Redundancies, obsessive thinking. Well, that's what keeps you from making mistakes, though. These spaces are both the same. Again, 7 5/16 down to the middle. And these are 2.5, 2.5, and 2.5 apart from one another. It's a sort of madness, isn't it, to be perfection-minded? But it always amuses me how the YouTube presenters out there in the woodworking genre are celebrated for not omitting their mistakes, because it's sort of a feigned modesty, isn't it? See, there are an infinite number of mistakes that you can make. And so if I choose to show my mistakes, the ones that I show aren't really going to help you if you're duplicating this project. The goal, the thing that will help you, is reducing the number of mistakes you make. And as a presenter, I shouldn't be making them, because if I am, that means my presentation wasn't very well thought out, was it? But man, talk about an easy way to get some brownie points on a YouTube video. Show a mistake, and you're a man of the people. They'll love you for it. Let's be honest. This is because we like to watch knowing that we're more capable than the presenter. It gives us a sense of competence and a sort of smug feeling of superiority to watch people make mistakes that we know we wouldn't have made. Oh, do I make mistakes? Sweet mother of pearl, I make a lot of mistakes. So many I'm like just borderline incompetent, which is why I've developed this sort of obsessive scrutiny that I apply to my work, so that I'm constantly staying in the now and paying attention to what I'm doing and catching all the errors in real time. And there are lots of them. I don't need to bore you with them, though. About a minute and a half back, I was yapping on about something or other, and I was using a scratch awl to make a bunch of divots where I was about to drill. It's a really nice trick, because then you can use the tip of your Forstner bit. Also works with a spade bit, and you kind of, as the bit spins, let the piece float, and it will kind of nest down into the divot. As it does that, hold it still and clamp it. You can see here in the footage, though, that as you clamp one side, the other side of the piece you're drilling might pop up. So mind that. Clamp each side only gently and work your way down. When you're drilling deep holes like these, it's a good idea to clamp the piece down, just so that the hole doesn't drift. If you've been reading the footnotes along the way, one of them said something about listening to what your intuition has to say, but not allowing it alone to dictate the course of your behavior. The idea here is to mix media. What I mean is that you have the ability to measure, but you also have the ability to hold something in place and compare it to a set distance. In other words, use some third object as an object for comparison. In other words, hold it up and mark it. We'll be doing both. We'll take a measurement and we'll hold it up and mark it. And we'll use both of those pieces of evidence to determine ultimately what we choose to do. Again, it's the same philosophy. Make a mark here, and you go in between those two marks. Reduce error.
If you really want to increase your accuracy overall, you'll use both. You'll mix media.
The copper is sunk into the wood an inch, and so doing the math gives me a prediction of 45 inches. Holding it up and marking it tells me almost the same story. It's saying that the pipe will be slightly short, and that's what I want, so we'll go with that. New to using a pipe cutter? No worries. Pay attention to these two little rollers up here. Oh, it's a Bostitch classic yellow cedar. First thing we do is get those rollers to roll. Let them snap in and then start to tighten the knob. And as you do, make sure that the cutting wheel lines up with your mark. You should be able to cut a pipe to the 32nd of an inch. I apply a drop of mineral oil every time. Is it right to do so? Maybe, maybe not, but the cutting wheel is like 20 years old. Score all the way around first. And when your score lines up, you're in business. Move all the way around before you adjust. Tightening about a quarter turn, not even, with each pass. Just keep it snug all the time, the whole way through, consistency. The whole way through, consistency. Not so fast. I made a mistake and I wanted to leave this in the video so that you could profit from my mistake. Look really, really close right here. This bolt has a square part on it right here, and you can turn it with this little tiny 1/4-inch wrench. This is important because when I was doing this, you can barely make it out, but I filed corners here and here on all 4 sides to make it so that the square bolt, when it's aligned properly, doesn't spin. That's the way it goes. Very happy with that. At eye level, you can barely see any of it. Maybe just one pipe sometimes. So it is an affectation. Oh well, on to the next one.